Hi, I'm Renee.
And I'm Eric.
Today, we're going to talk about school safety and threat assessment and what you can do to help keep your school safe.
School safety is a complex topic. Overall, schools are very safe places, but we want to do everything we can to keep them safe. That's why we created this program, which covers all forms of aggression at school, from rare, severe events such as shootings to more common, less severe incidents such as bullying and fighting.
Although we are concerned about school shootings and want to review ways to prevent them, keep in mind that they are rare. Nationwide, there's an average of 21 homicides of students per year in our schools. That means the majority of the nation's 125,000 schools will never have a homicide. Dividing 125,000 schools by 21 homicides per year tells us that student homicides occur in 1 out of approximately 6,000 schools. Another way to think about this is that the average school will experience a student homicide every 6,000 years.
Violence is more of a community problem than a school problem, and students may be exposed to violence in their community. Shootings are a serious national concern, with approximately 12,000 gun homicides every year in the U.S. FBI crime statistics show that homicides are 10 times more likely to occur in a restaurant than in a school, and homicides are 200 times more likely to occur in a residence than in a school. While we should be concerned about school shootings, we should also keep them in perspective.
Violence at school, even shootings, can be prevented. Research on school shootings has found that most attackers made threats of violence before their attack. Many school shootings have been prevented because the student's threat was reported, investigated, and found to be serious. That's one reason law enforcement and education authorities have recommended that threats of violence be investigated using a standard threat assessment process. The threat assessment team helps students, faculty, and staff recognize and report threats or threatening behavior.
Who are the members of the threat assessment team?
Threat assessment team typically includes the principal or assistant principal, a law enforcement officer, such as a school resource officer, and other staff members such as a counselor, psychologist, social worker, and teacher.
What is threat assessment?
Threat assessment is a standard process for investigating threatening statements or behavior. The goal of threat assessment is to prevent violence by first assessing the situation and then intervening to resolve threats before they escalate. Threat assessment can be used to prevent any form of violence, from bullying to shootings.
A threat is defined as any communication or behavior that conveys an intent to harm someone. Threats can be made directly to the intended target or indirectly to a third party. Threats can be explicit, such as, "I'm going to kill you," or implied, such as, "You better watch out."
All school staff members are expected to report serious threats to school authorities. There is no need to report a threat that's obviously not serious. But if you're not sure whether a threat is serious, then you should report it. Threats should be reported to a member of the threat assessment team or to a school administrator. It's better to report a threat in person or by telephone so you can explain what you know.
It's important to encourage students and parents to report threats that seem serious. These threats should also be reported in person or by telephone. Many schools have hotlines or websites where threats can be reported anonymously. Most threats are not serious. Statements such as, "I'm going to kill you," or "I want to blow up this school," could be serious or not serious depending on the situation. Students might say something when they're angry, but not really mean it, and schools don't want to overreact to threats that aren't serious. Sometimes the threat is serious, and someone really could get hurt. The threat assessment team's job is to decide whether a threat is serious, and if it is, stop it from being carried out.
Threats can mean different things, depending on the situation and the person's intentions. Let's start with low-level threats. Sometimes threats are just figures of speech or jokes that aren't serious. Other times, threats are expressions of anger that aren't literal. Threats might also be attempts to get attention, cause a disruption, or frighten somebody, even though the person doesn't intend to carry them out. These kinds of threats will receive disciplinary consequences, but they are not as serious as threats indicating impending violence.
The threat assessment team focuses on identifying how serious the threat is. The more information you can give the team, the better. Threat assessment teams sometimes classify threats depending on how serious they are. Non-serious threats might be classified as low-risk or transient threats. Threats that are more serious might be called high-risk or substantive threats.
In many cases, a threatening situation involves an argument, conflict, or some other kind of problem between individuals. Threat assessment is often a problem-solving process. A threat indicates that a student is frustrated with the problem he or she cannot solve. The team looks for ways to help the student learn more acceptable ways to solve the problem. Bullying and harassment are common in schools. Bullying can have serious consequences for students, resulting in anxiety, depression, and poor academic performance. Bullying can also escalate into more serious acts of violence.
Threat assessment teams conduct an evaluation of a threat by interviewing witnesses, the person who made the threat, and other people, such as teachers and parents, who can help the team better understand the situation. A comprehensive threat assessment may include a law enforcement investigation, as well as a mental health evaluation of the student, referral for special education evaluation, and other services. The extent of the evaluation depends on the seriousness of the threat, and a comprehensive threat assessment is not needed in every case. Next, we'll show you a situation that could happen at your school. Take a minute to watch the following video.
I'm gonna catch him in the cafeteria and take him out.
It's important to emphasize to students that if a student talks seriously about killing someone or brings a gun to school, it should be reported immediately. Threat assessment can save lives. School shootings have been prevented because a student reported a threat.
Look, I'm worried that he really means it, but I don't want to be a snitch.
A snitch is somebody who tells on you to get something for himself. It's not snitching if you're trying to keep somebody from getting hurt.
Sometimes students don't want to report a threat because they think it's snitching. But there's a big difference between snitching and seeking help. Explain to your students that snitching is something people do for their own benefit. For example, some students might snitch to get out of trouble. Emphasize that they aren't snitching if they report a threat. They're trying to prevent someone from being hurt.
How will you feel if he actually does it? What if he kills someone and you could have done something to stop it?
There have been many situations where a shooting was prevented because a student reported a threat. In schools where shootings did occur, there were often students who decided not to say anything.
I guess you're right. I don't want anybody getting killed if I could prevent it. Who do I talk to about this?
Encourage students to report threats to an adult they trust, such as a teacher, counselor, coach, principal, or police officer.
Okay, I don't know how to say this, but I'm kind of worried about Connor.
Oh, well, if you're worried about him, I want to know.
Well, see, he said he had a gun and he was going to shoot Evan in the cafeteria.
Oh, wow. Okay, you did the right thing by letting me know. I want to make sure I understand the situation. Tell me more about this.
At the 1999 FBI Conference on School Shootings, someone in the audience objected that we could never convince all of our students that they should report threats. The reply? We don't need to convince every student to report a threat. We only need to convince one. And in fact, studies have found that one student has made the difference in averting many potential shootings. Even if we can't convince all students, we can increase the likelihood of preventing violence by convincing as many students as possible.
Because threat assessment is a violence prevention strategy, it's different from other kinds of school safety measures. Threat assessment is different from a crisis response plan that's enacted after violence erupts, and from building security measures such as door locks and surveillance cameras. Threat assessment, like other prevention models, can take place on 3 levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary.
Primary prevention is also called universal prevention. It involves programs for all students. Some examples of a threat assessment approach on a primary prevention level are encouraging students to treat one another with respect and not use threatening language, encouraging students to seek help when a classmate has been threatened, teased, or bullied, and teaching all students that seeking help to prevent violence is not snitching.
Secondary prevention is also called targeted or supplemental prevention. It involves services for students who are identified as at risk for violence. Some examples of a threat assessment response on a secondary prevention level include short-term counseling for a student with anger problems, conflict resolution for a dispute between peers, and interventions for students who engaged in verbal bullying.
Tertiary prevention is also called intensive or indicated prevention. It involves individualized services for a small group of students who have already demonstrated serious potential for violence. Tertiary prevention efforts may involve special education services, ongoing behavior plans, or placement in an alternative school.
Now, let's talk more generally about threats. Students sometimes make threatening statements they don't really mean, so threat assessment does not follow a zero-tolerance policy. Instead, disciplinary actions are based on the seriousness of the misbehavior. Students are not automatically suspended or arrested for making a threat. In a very serious situation, a student might be suspended or transferred to a different school. In some cases, students have been arrested. If a student threatens someone in a way that truly frightens them, then it can be considered a crime.
A threat that seems like a joke to a student might be taken seriously by someone else. Students should avoid making threatening statements because they might be misunderstood.
Students need to understand that making threats via email, text, or the internet can be considered a crime. Some examples of threats that could result in a student's arrest and being charged with a felony are sending a text or email that says something such as, "I'm going to kill you for that," or posting something online such as, "It's time to blow up this school." Threatening statements can be misinterpreted, and we should help students understand that some threats are a violation of state or federal law. Some incidents, such as fights, may break out without warning, and no threat assessment was possible. In cases where a fight or assault has already occurred, the threat assessment team may want to conduct a threat assessment focused on whether a student might commit an additional violent act in the future.
Threats of suicide or self-harm, such as cutting, should always be reported. In most cases, threats to self are handled by the school's procedures for responding to suicide and self-harm. If there is an additional concern that the student may want to harm others, a threat assessment that considers self-harm and harm to others will be conducted.
Threat assessment has been tested in schools for more than 15 years, and there's strong scientific evidence that it's safe and effective. Research in Virginia schools has found that 99% of threat assessment cases are resolved without the threat being carried out. In the first 2 years since the state law was enacted, school threat assessment teams responded to 3,335 student threats to harm others. Only 42, or 1% of the threats were carried out. These threats involve fights that did not result in serious injuries.
Threat assessment can't prevent all acts of violence, but it can help reduce violence. Research shows that schools that use threat assessment have less bullying and peer aggression. Teachers report feeling safer in schools that use threat assessment.
There's a lot of concern about the high rates of out-of-school suspensions, But schools that use threat assessment are less likely to use long-term suspensions and alternative placements. There has also been concern nationwide about racial disparities in school suspension. But research has found that when schools use a threat assessment approach, those disparities are not present. In Virginia schools, there have been no racial differences in suspension rates for Black, Hispanic, and white students who are seen for a threat assessment. In summary, threat assessment is a violence prevention strategy that can help keep our schools safe. Threat assessment teams assess each student individually so that we can take actions that do not overreact or underreact to student behavior. However, threat assessment depends on the willingness of students, parents, and teachers to recognize and report threatening statements or behaviors. Share what you've learned in this program with your students. And if you see or hear anything that concerns you, consult with your school team. Thank you for watching this presentation on school safety and threat assessment. If you have any questions or concerns, please speak with a member of your school's threat assessment team.